Welcome to the Mauer Museum. We have a special program tonight, and I'll introduce our special guest in just a couple of moments. First, I want to tell you a little bit about the museum and what's going on at the Mauer Museum. We're closed now, except we open one day a week from 1 to 4 on Saturdays. The Mauer Museum is located in the center of Mauer, and our mission is to preserve and collect artifacts, photographs, historical records, and documents to tell the story and preserve the story of the history of Mauer. Next. We have important and exciting rotating exhibits going on now. We have an important exhibit, Women Fight the Right to Vote. Another exhibit on the College Comes to Mauer, Ramapo College, 1965-75, that's celebrating the 50th anniversary of Ramapo. Palisades Amusement Park is very popular, and the Levo Gallery photographs of various scenes around town of Mauer. Next. We have 3 important permanent exhibits. Les Paul in Mauer. Les Paul was a resident of Mauer for 60 years. We have the best artifacts from the Les Paul Foundation on exhibit, and we're very grateful for the Les Paul Foundation for the loan of these artifacts. Donald Cooper Model Railroad, very elaborate railroad that's very popular with young and old, and the old station and caboose that's normally open in the summer months. We have a very substantial archive. We're adding to our collection all the time. We're looking forward to the support of the local community to help us build our archive. In normal times, we have group tours of the museum, and educators, seniors, and special needs. You can make appointments once this COVID crisis is over. You can go to our website and make appointments for your group to visit. Next. We have a store in the museum dedicated to some of the literature about our current exhibits and about the history of Mauer. Palisades Amusement Park. We have an autographed copy by Vince Garulio of Palisades Amusement Park, an ever popular publication. Ongoing, the best town history in the state of New Jersey by Bischoff and Kahn. A history of Mauer from 1700 to 1976, and other publications, Ford Motor Company, ABEX, and others listed on our website and available through the mauermuseum.org. Next. So we're always looking for new volunteers. We're looking for new members. We need new members at all. Museum societies and volunteer societies need. Please think about joining the museum, becoming active in the museum, making a donation to our future if you're able. Next. And so in Mauer, we preserve the stories, and you can learn the stories. Visit the museum once again, Saturdays from 1 to 4. We're in the middle of Mauer, 201 Franklin Turnpike. More information about everything I've talked about is at themauermuseum.org. And with that, I'd like to welcome our speaker tonight, Peggy Norris, a longtime friend of the Mauer Museum. And she's going to talk about quilts and emphasizing the great variety of quilts were made between 1800 and 1976, particularly in Bergen County. Peggy is a well-known local historian, very knowledgeable about local history, a member of the Bergen County Historical Association, the Ridgewood Historical Association, and the local historian for the local history room for the Ridgewood Library. And with that, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Peggy once again and thank you for joining us tonight and offering your insights to quilts in Bergen County.
Thank you, Charlie. I'm glad to be here. I'm going to share my screen. Did that work?
Yes, it looks good.
Okay. I'm just going to give a little background here before I really launch into things. There's a small committee from the Upper Saddle River and Ridgewood Historical Societies that is planning a Bergen County Quilt and Coverlet show. We have been we invited all the museums in Bergen County to work with us to show their collections. And we were invited by 15 museums, and we went in, we looked at and selected quilts and coverlets for the show, and we photographed them, and we've scheduled the show twice. And the good news is that we do have an exhibit catalog that will be released this spring. And that's sort of backwards way of doing things, but this is not normal times. So I am using the quilts that we've seen and are going to be in the exhibit to tell you a little bit about quilts and about their role, and a little bit about the women. The women who made them are often quite anonymous, except under their husbands' names. So I'm going to be mentioning some of their names, and several people said to me, but I can't remember them all. And no, you don't need to remember them all. I think it's important to say the names when we know it. So I'm going to turn off my camera and I'm going to get started, and I'll be back after the program to answer questions. You can put your questions in the chat.
So if for 1 second, Peggy, they put their questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's marked Q&A.
Yes.
Not marked chat.
Right.
And if you want to get rid of the little boxes on your screen, you just click that minus sign on the upper left there. You don't need to look at my basket square the whole time. So on this slide, you can see us, we have our a coverlet hanging up ready for the photographer. We worked with our masks on and got good photographs of everything. Marion Brown took the photographs, and without her, this wouldn't have happened. And that's a draft of the cover for the exhibit catalog. So why quilts? Why do we even have quilts? Well, the first thing one thinks of is they keep us warm. But there's a lot of other reasons that we have and use quilts. We commemorate things. We make gifts for people, particularly people we love. We use quilts in service. We honor people. We comfort people. We raise money for things we care about. Quilts show our status, and quilts are made for show, sort of two different things. And we make quilts of remembrance, memorial quilts, quilts of friendship, and quilts of storytelling. So we're going to see all of these quilts again as we go through the program. What is a quilt? Well, it's complicated sometimes, but the basic definition is something that has a backing, a filling or batting, and a top. And those three layers are somehow fastened together, and that becomes a quilt. And when we go back into the 19th century and before, these are the fibers that were available to people. Flax, from which we get linen, cotton, silk, and wool. And the procedures for processing all four of those are very labor intensive. And I just have a few pictures here to show spinning, preparing flax. You had to wash things before they could be woven. You had to wash things after they were woven. Very labor intensive. The Jersey Dutch lived in houses like this, which is at historic Newbridge Landing. That's the Campbell Christie house. This house is a little fancy, but the Jersey Dutch often had their beds built into like a cupboard or a box for warmth. This would be a very fancy one, but I think in some of ours, there would have been that kind of bed early on. And the kind of covers they had would be woven covers, like this coverlet owned by the Oakland Historical Society. And simple beds with simple fabrics. These are fabrics that were dyed in the yarn and could be woven at home, and you could get simple patterns on them and simple beds. So this is an example, the hangings here, of something that could be made with either homespun or commercial fabric. These are valances, so they would go here around the bed, three sides, and this is a little close-up of one, and here's even more. It's embroidered with cotton yarn onto cotton fabric. Another example of something that could be done simply, although quite time consuming, an embroidered spread. This is the center of it. You can see with the light behind it, same kind of technique as the valance. And this is a stuffed work piece that's small, that is quilted and then stuffed in relief. This shows the pattern as it exists today. And this is a reproduction piece that I made that shows you what it would have looked like. And this is the design on the end there that I copied. So the Industrial Revolution is happening in the 18th century and into the 19th. And we've gradually mechanized things. We have the cotton gin for cleaning the cotton, spinning jenny for making thread. We have weaving machines, mechanical weaving machines, and we have the ability to print fabric on a cylinder printing. So all of these things result in fabrics that can look like this. If we had a fabric looking like this from the 18th century, it would probably be handmade and extremely expensive. The mechanization, the Industrial Revolution, was the beginning of fabric becoming affordable to the middle class. And then your bed could be decorated with these printed fabrics or with a quilt made from these fabrics. This is a quilt owned by the Ridgewood Historical Society that had its origins in Holland and came to this country in the 20th century. We think of our Dutch forefathers and mothers in this county, and they came in the 17th century, many of them. But this quilt was made in the Netherlands about 1800, and when Nell Kempstra immigrated to this country, she brought it with her and eventually donated it. This is what the town, Garnchem in the Netherlands, looks like about that time. This is some close-ups of some of the fabrics. This is silk, and then these are printed cottons, all different varieties. And in this simple quilt block, so we're going to look at the fact that you can put something on, when you make those 3 layers, the top layer can be decorated. So the first group of quilts we're going to look at, the top is pieced. So we have pieces of fabric that are sewn together. This is sewn on the machine. They could be sewn by hand. And then that top that's sewn together, it looks like this, can be layered with the batting in the back. This is a quilt from the Dater family, was probably made in New Jersey, Bergen County. It's from the 1840s, probably 1850s. This is the pieced part. So we went directly from those nice big squares to little tiny diamond shapes. And those are precisely pieced. That would be all pieced by hand and set into this beautiful pheasant and palm chintz. There's a up close and personal look at this chintz. This would have been a very expensive fabric, and I think pretty unusual for Bergen County at that time. The Daters were on the wealthy end of things. This is another early Bergen County quilt, much simpler, using 2 different kinds of fabric, and owned by, probably made by, Catherine Hopper Van Buskirk. This is a close-up of those fabrics, and you can see that it's just pieced triangles, and the fabric is cut into the triangles without regard to the pattern on it, but it gives a sort of lovely variety to the surface. It's another quilt from the Dater family. It's also mid-19th century, and a pattern that we call today the Delectable Mountains, after an allegory in John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. And again, these are the pieced triangles, squares, triangles, all pieced together. This is another quilt that was made locally in not Bergen County, but up by Sugarloaf in Rockland County. Or is that Orange County? Anyway, not too far from here. And it eventually came to Bergen County with descendants who eventually donated the quilt. No, they didn't donate. It belongs to Anthony Cavo, one of our private collectors that is participating in the show. And this is all pieced with no straight lines. They're all curved lines here. Today, we might piece this by splitting some of these and making a square block or a octagonal block, but this is the block. So it's not really a block at all, but this is something that's easier to do when you're piecing by hand, and this is all pieced by hand. And there's a wonderful variety of fabrics in it. This is another one. This is from Ulster County. It's called a Caesar's Crown, and it's made with a real early chintz. this brown fabric. You can see up close how rich this chintz is. All of these places are places where the fabric is failing. The brown dyes were very corrosive and basically destroy the fabric. And we have this shape piecing here. So still curves and straight pieces, but this is all pieced. And when we hung it to take the photograph, there right in the middle was her name, Maria Vernoy. So we were able to figure out who made this quilt and put her name there, which is how we know it was from Ulster County. This is a pieced log cabin quilt. This may have been made in Bergen County. It was from the Banta family, but the two previous generations of wives in that family, the mother and the grandmother, both were from other places, not from New Jersey. So it's perfectly possible this was made in the Midwest or made in Pennsylvania. We didn't see any other log cabins like this in the museum collections. But this is has these fabrics that with the stripes that really make your eye move around on that surface. And this is the block. And it's usually done with one side dark and one side light. And that's what makes the shape, is when you arrange those blocks so that the darks and lights make the stripes. So there are all sorts of ways that you can lay out that kind of dark and light block. And this pattern way of laying it out is called barn raising. And there's that block again, with the light and the dark. Another way to decorate the surface of the quilt, the top, is to applique or sew a piece of fabric down onto the top. So you can see here, this is sewed up the side here, but not yet sewed here. So that would lay over and you would sew that down. This quilt belongs to the Mahwah Museum. It's in the Krauss Palmer collection. And it is an amazing chintz cutout applique quilt. The fabric that this was made from, basically, you could take a small piece of fabric, cut out the motifs, and arrange them on a bigger plain piece of fabric and come out with a bed-size quilt without having to buy bed-size fancy fabric. But this one is extremely finely made. And this is what I call status. You had to have a lot of money to buy or make something like this. And so it wasn't just for show, it was just because you had, everything you had was nice. But only people who had money could have a quilt like this. This is a close-up of one of the flowers, the camellias. Insects, butterflies, moths. So there's a spider on this one. And these beautiful Asian peacock pheasants. And the way this is done is these figures are cut out of the chintz and then appliqued with a teeny tiny buttonhole stitch around every single edge. Sometimes you see this same fabric, somebody cuts it out like this, and they look pretty good. This maker cut around every single thing. So all of this is cut and embroidered. These tiny feet are cut out, etc. So Very interesting quilt, very fortunate for Mawa Museum Society to own this quilt. This is a quilt owned by the Paramus Fritz Benke Museum, and it is mostly applique. These little tulip things are pieced. And then all of this, then this is pieced, and then this is appliqued down. Doesn't even look like it's pieced. This could be pieced, but this one looks like it was just cut out of the fabric and appliqued to the base fabric. Red and green was very popular for a long period of time in the mid 19th century. And this is a red and green quilt made in Bergen County. And then we get to the height of applique in about 1860s in Bergen County, earlier other places. And they were showing off their skills. And this quilt was made half of the blocks were made by Eliza Zabriskie Banta, and they were made for her sister, younger sister, Margaret Jane Zabriskie, who married Martin Hogenkamp. And the blocks were in the family, pinned to a sheet and never finished. And the woman who owned them had them finished and quilted by an Amish group in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and then eventually donated to the Zabriskie House Museum. It's very interesting to examine each block. This is the eagle block. It's got very popular eagle pose, especially during the Civil War. And this was made right at the end of the Civil War with the shield on the front. This is a applique block from another album quilt, also owned by the Zabriskie House. And it has enormous amount of detail, a little basket, the hearts, a little tiny carriage over the woman's names, S.J. DeBon, the bird, and these two darling little girls in their little dresses. And the dresses are fashionable. They match the dresses of the time. So this is from the Philadelphia Museum of Art. The neckline is off the shoulder. It's decorated at the top and across the sleeve, little band at the waist, and a very full skirt. And the maker managed to capture all of that in her little applique. And this is sort of the ultimate end result of the applique, one color, red on white, in very simple shapes. And it's stunning to see it all. And I was watching a program from a quilt person that talked about this leaf, and it's a leaf from the castor bean plant. And it appears on several quilts and it was probably an exotic plant at that time. And I think that this wreath around that eagle is maybe a Christmas cactus. This picture of that gives you that same idea. It's not literal, but it's definitely something different than what we would normally think of. Then you can decorate the surface of the quilt with embroidery. And embroidery comes into play in a lot of places as we've talked along, but I thought I would share this, that it can be the whole surface of the quilt can be embroidery. This was a fundraising quilt made by the Pastor's Help Society of the Presbyterian Church, now is First Presbyterian Church, and it was used for fundraising. You could pay a small price to have your name on the quilt, and then the quilt was raffled or donated or auctioned so that you could raise even more money. And this was in private hands for a long time, and then eventually donated to Ridgewood Historical Society. So the Pastors Help Society and that church were in Ridgewood also. But you can see not only do we get the names, but we get these beautiful flowers outlined and a little girl with more flowers, all done in red embroidery thread. It's another embroidered quilt made by Joan Aliata, and this is all cross-stitched. And these were often made in sort of imitation of applique quilts, but they became their own thing to make a cross-stitch quilt top. And this is also cross-stitch, and this is the binding. Then another aspect of a quilt is how they are held together. And we call these stitching lines quilting. And it's often done, at least in the 19th century, in the frame. And this little image from 1865 shows these young women sitting around a frame and someone else preparing food. You can't have quilting without food. So here you can see the outline of that shape. And this is sort of a romantic painting of a quilting. Again, showing them sitting around the frame. And here we have from 1813, the frolic that's coming after the quilting, because there was an event where you got together and quilted all afternoon, and then the young men came and you had a party. And this young lady is cutting the quilt off of the frame. This tape is unwinding. She's throwing it with abandon. So we know that this was how they did things. We have that from writings as well. And we think also that not all the quilts were done that way, but some of them were. Some would be done at home individually. So we're going to look at a little bit of quilting. This is a basket quilt from either Western Pennsylvania or Eastern Ohio, owned by the Meadowlands Museum. This is the block, and then the block next to it is plain white. And in the plain white block, you get this feathered wreath with the cross hatching inside and straight lines emphasizing the outside. So the whole surface of this quilt is covered with quilting that gives a texture and a visual interest to the quilt that you don't see in that overall picture. It doesn't show up here. A little bit up here. And this is the back of that Caesar's Crown quilt, where you can see not only are the shapes of the fabrics outlined, but we have added hearts. And there are added things all over this quilt. Here is in the border, this beautiful swag border. Here is a figure. It's 2 leaves and a flower. And this is the cross-stitch quilt again. And here, not only after all the cross-stitching is done, then there's this beautiful quilting that is done in all of the white spaces. And quilting is not the only way to hold a quilt together. You can also tie it. And these are ties that come through from the back and are tied on the front. And this one is made decorative by putting a black felt circle and a red wool flower underneath the quilt knot. This is what that whole quilt looks like. And this is one of those warmth quilts for warmth. And this also, this and the next one represent make do or utility quilts, being made in the most efficient manner possible and still providing some beauty for the functional purpose of keeping your bed warm. This one belongs to Upper Saddle River Historical Society, and it is like the ultimate make-do quilt. The back is made of home-dyed sugar sacks and flour sacks. Those things came in muslin sacks, and there were directions how to wash out the lettering, but it didn't always work. And of course, the dyeing job's a little bit patchy. This is some different ones from another quilt that lets you see closer how you can see the shadowing of these letters. This was flour, best flour, and this was a bag of laundry detergent. The third thing about this quilt is that the batting inside is actually another quilt. So this quilt recycled another quilt as the warm part of the inside of the quilt. And the ties, we didn't look closely at those, but the ties are probably made from the strings that were used to make the bags. So we also make quilts for comfort. This is a picture of the Brownstone Quilters Guild making a quilt to give away. We call them service quilts, and they're donated to Project Linus, Family Promise, Tomorrow's Children, and many more organizations that would like quilts to provide to their residents or clients. And it's a way of saying, okay, this can not only keep you warm, but somebody cared enough to make something by hand for you. And this is another one of our members makes a lot of these for the children's quilts, called I Spy Quilt, because every block here has something different to look at. And comfort quilts were also made during World War II. These are Canadian Red Cross workers, and the Mennonite Service Committee made, and they were sent to Europe. They needed warmth, but this was also, again, a way of saying, we care about you. And this is an example of one of those quilts. This is not in the show, but I thought you'd find that interesting. And then we get to a whole era starting in the 1880s and up into about 1900 of crazy quilts and other fancies. This is Anna Maria Green Ackerman Christopher, and she made this quilt, and she fancy embroidered the initials of all of her immediate family members. This is EYA for Elizabeth Young Ackerman and JOA for Jacob O. Ackerman. Both of these were her siblings. And you can see this kind of quilt is made of irregular patches, and often the seam lines are all decorated with different kinds of embroidery. So it's not only embroidery, but obviously embroidery is a big part of how this quilt looks, and you could show off every single stitch you ever learned making this quilt. And these figures, some of these were ones you could copy from magazines, and this little baby's head figure is pretty common on crazy quilts because it had a unique source. This is another log cabin quilt, but very different from the other one. It's made from silk, and but there is the block that's the light on one side and the dark on the other. Here's another quilt made of silk, and it's like bricks. And this would be later. This was made down in southern part of Bergen County, probably made from, may have been made from scraps from one of the textile mills where some of the men were working. And you can see up close, some of these are just rectangles. Some of them are actually ribbon. And again, it's embroidered along the seams, and the quilting is just diagonally across each block. And a lot of these silk things were not practical. They were used for show. And this is the Victorian household into which these might be used. You can see that there is a fancy tablecloth. There's a fancy covering of some kind over another table or a book. And here it looks like a bookcase. This is possibly piano. Every surface has some kind of cover on it or pattern. And this quilt is made from silk ribbons and would have made a stunning showcase on your parlor sofa or your tea table. Not to serve tea on, but to admire. And here you can see some of the ribbons. This is something that it would be great fun to investigate whether some of these ribbons may have been made in Patterson. This is supposed to have been made by an Ackerman. Of course, there are way too many Ackermans to figure out anything from just that information, but could have been in Bergen County or Passaic County. And show meant lots of different things. Here we have the minister coming to have Sunday dinner with his family, and they are all paying attention to him. And I bet if you turned around and could look over here, there would be a bed, or at least one bed in this room, and she would have put on it the best quilt that she had, because when the pastor came to visit, you wanted everything to be just so. And it could have looked like this. And here we have a museum in Indiana, and the best quilt goes on the guest bed for when you have guests coming. And in the 19th century, often travelers friends who came, might stay a few nights, and you would make sure that their bed was covered with the best. This is another fancy, it's a variation of the log cabin, and it's a pineapple block, but it doesn't use that dark and light shading in the same way. This was made by, you can see the different kinds of silk and velvets. These are velvet, and the centers are all velvet, and then we have these different silks. So it was made by this woman's first cousin who lived in New Paltz, and Catherine lived in Paramus. So quite a bit of distance between, but still connected. And so it came from her to Catherine, and then passed down through these women, and then Isabel and her husband donated it to the Ridgewood Historical Society. And I just thought it was interesting to see and important to point out that all of these treasures need guardians every generation. And it's important to pass the things down and pass them with a story. So this story about who made this quilt stayed with the quilt until it was donated. So another function of quilts is to acknowledge friendship and family. So this is a quilt owned by Joseph Blicky that we think was made for Maggie Salyer Zabriskie. I got the name wrong. Okay, I'm not going to try to figure that out. She and her husband had moved to Brooklyn a few years previous to when this was made. So we think her relatives, mostly relatives, made the blocks, put them together, and presented her with the quilt. And then it came down and was passed down in the family. So this block shows Mrs. G.H.R., and that's Mrs. Garrett H. Ramsey, and her name was Kate Demarest Ramsey. And her daughter, she and all of her daughters contributed blocks. So here's Maggie, and this would have been Maggie Ramsey, Mrs. G.H.R.'s daughter. And you can see the elaborate embroidery again along here and in the middle of the blocks, and all different kinds of silks and velvets. This is another kind of friendship quilt. This is a chimney suite block, and these are in the middle are signed each by a different person. So Mrs. John Y. Dater signed this one, and the Dater family has been really important in Ramsey. The Mrs. John Y. Dater may have owned or had something to do with those Dater family quilts we looked at in the beginning. And this is her as a young bride and her in her older years. This quilt would have been made when she looked more like this, but had to share this photo too. And this is another of those applique album quilts, and it has, as those did, names on each of the blocks. This one was made in the Brickell and Forchet families, and it's, you know, there are a lot of blocks, so there are a lot of names on here. And this one includes names of men. So here we have M.E.B., Francis M. Treadway, and George E. Blauvelt. A lot of these are done in the same little teeny tiny cross stitch in red thread, so they may have been done by one person, whereas like on that Ramsey quilt, everybody signed their own name in ink. This is interesting to look at some of the things. Block shows some of the things that were important to women. Her scissors, her basket, the pants that she made and mended, a little purse called a reticule. I found a picture of one, and still working on trying to figure this out. This could be an iron, but what's this? So there were trays that the irons could be put on, and maybe that's what she's intending to convey, but it also could be something entirely different. And you can see from this photo, you can see that the quilting, we've got double lines around each of the figures, and then these leaves added in to provide a little quilting where we have the big white space. Another block that I don't have as good a picture of has a harrow in here, and this is an example of one. It's an agricultural implement for breaking up soil, would pulled by a horse or mule. And don't understand why the arrows, but there they are. And another applique quilt, this is not in the show, but is owned by the Historical Society of Rockland County. In the center of this quilt, there is a memory block in memory of Edmund H. Thompson, died June 3rd, 1851, aged 20 years. Blessed are they who die in the Lord. And there's actually a little portrait of him in the applique. So other kinds of remembrance are things like the AIDS quilt, the AIDS Memorial Quilt. This is when it was displayed in 1996 in Washington, D.C., and the whole mall is covered with these quilt panels. And individual people made a quilt panel section that were then assembled into panels remembering someone who died of AIDS. And we honor people, particularly our servicemen. Here's John McCain receiving a quilt from the Quilts of Valor Foundation. Those kinds of ceremonies occur in communities across the country with people making quilts for veterans. And this is a quilt that was made in Bergen County by one of the Brownstone Quilt members to be used by a Marine Corps organization to acknowledge a fundraiser. So honoring again. We have covers for children that hold special place in our hearts because many of them are gifts of love. And I've met several women who started quilting because they had a child or a grandchild on the way and they wanted to make a quilt. This was made in, say, 1950, and these are all appliqued, the little squares, instead of pieced. This pattern can also be pieced. And then the little figures in the middle are appliqued, and we have some little embroidery flowers. This is a Layette set that we show here displayed in a bassinet. There's a pillow, a little plain cover, and a quilted cover. These were made in the Midwest. It was homework that some enterprising women hired other women to do and then marketed them at high-end department stores. So this still in the collection of Anthony Cavo is still in its original box, complete with pictures of fussy babies. It's probably from the 1920s, and it has the label on it for Sacs Herald Square. This is another embroidery quilt. We sometimes call this red work, and we call these penny squares because they were sold for a penny in the department stores or local dry goods store, and then you could embroider it and put them together to make a quilt. There you can see one of the blocks, and this tag that's on there indicates that this quilt was entered in the Sears Century of Progress Quilt Contest, which took place in 1933. And it was meant to have new quilts made, but this one was made in 1905 and was entered in the contest. And local people entered them into the contest by submitting them to the Sears department store. And this one was displayed and entered at the Sears and Roebuck in Hackensack. Storytelling has a long history in quilt making, and the I Spy quilt is that I showed you earlier is a kind of storytelling. This is a Victorian 1880 quilt made of velvets and silks that has images on it. This is not in the show, but it belongs to the Bergen County Historical Society and was made by Kate Harris Bogia. And the other story quilt here is from the Hmong people that immigrated to this country and produced these to tell their stories, and they are appliqué. And quilting continues in the 20th century. This is an image of quilters in 1976 at the Upper Saddle River Library, quilting on their bicentennial quilt. This palm leaf quilt, very simple, 2 colors, and the pattern was published in the 1930s, and this was about all you had to go on. Today you'd have 4 or 5 pages of directions, but this is what they gave you. These were the templates that were used to make the pieces. And these kinds of patterns and the templates were sold all the way up. This is a Ridgewood News article from advertisement from 1980, and you could send away for these quilt templates. The batting came rolled up with a wrapper around it, and the Mountain Mist wrappers advertised the quilt patterns that they had available. And then on the inside was a quilt pattern. So you got a free quilt pattern when you bought your batting from Mountain Mist. This is a yo-yo quilt, it's a 40s kind of thing. And she's very nicely laid these out in concentric squares, rectangles. And these are made from little circles of fabric that have been gathered and then sewed together. And some of her circles are pieced. So here's one that has 3 different kinds of fabric in it to make her yo-yo. And here's what she did. It was her husband reported that she used a lid from a wooden cream cheese container to draw the circles on the fabric, and then you hem the edges of the circle and gather it, pull it tight, and sew it, and you get this little puff, and then you sew them all together, and then she sewed them in particular pattern so that you see those lines. This is a 1950s quilt made by Nakashian of Fairlawn. She came to this country from Armenia, lost all of her family in the Armenian genocide, and she came here and had 3 children. Her daughter kindly gave us permission to copy this picture. She made this top, which has not been finished, and it's the only thing in the show that we selected that was not finished. But we selected it for the unusual fabric in it that's very indicative of the 1950s. This is called bark cloth. It has a little bit of a texture to it and was used for drapes and sofa covers. And I found an ad for a fabric store in Ridgewood that says, large selection of highest quality bark cloth prints. And see how much you could use that bark cloth? That's a lot of drapes. And for commemoration, we have the bicentennial quilts. This one is from the Pascack Historical Society, and each scene was appliqued separately and these were made by groups of women and represent different scenes in the valley. So this one is a Collignon chair. They were chairs that were made in Rivervale and used on steamships as a standard deck chair. And there's the Hillsdale train station. And this is a cross-stitch quilt from the bicentennial era, and it was made, the top was made then, and it was quilted in 2019, and we hope to raffle it to provide funds to support the show. We just haven't figured out exactly when to do that, since we don't have a date scheduled for the show. Here's a close-up. You can see the cross stitch and the quilting. So I really like to thank my committee and our exhibit sponsors. The catalog is being supported by the American Quilt Study Group, the Bergen County Division of Cultural and Historic Affairs, and the Northwest Bergen History Coalition. And these are the participating museums and private donors. And with that, Ken, I think we can ask some questions.
Okay, we have a few questions. This is from Madeline. Do you know what years the status quilts were made?
Well, status was important at any time. The one that I showed, that chintz cutout applique, was made probably between 1800 and 1820. But so that's, if that's specifically what she wanted to know, that's about the date of that quilt.
Okay. Were artesian quilters commissioned by the wealthy to create quilts?
Want to say that again?
Yeah, I kind of messed that up. Were artesian quilters commissioned by the wealthy to create quilts?
Yeah, we think so. It sort of, there definitely were quilts made in the early time periods made in India and sold in Europe. And we think that there were quilts made in Europe that were sold here. It's impossible to tell. I'm of the opinion that some professional made that particular quilt because of the high quality of the workmanship. And the provenance of that traces to North Carolina and the governor of North Carolina, James Turner, or his, or the next generation down. So very wealthy people, and yes, they could have purchased it or commissioned the work done.
Okay, this is not a question, but it's a compliment from Ivy. Peggy, you did an amazing job. Thanks for all your hard work and wonderful information that you shared with us. And I concur with that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
From Diane, when quilts were new, were they ever washed?
Some of the fanciest quilts may never have been washed because they were not heavily used. The utility quilts and were often washed, and sometimes the harsh soaps have deteriorated the dyes and the fabrics. So the answer to the question is it depends, but yes, quilts were washed.
Okay, this is from Jan. Can you touch on the types of batting and if that is a way to tell the age?
I'm going to stop sharing my screen. People have had a chance to look at that. There's a myth that you can look for cotton seeds in your batting, and that would indicate that it was old, and it is a myth. The cotton can be dirty whether it's old or whether it's new. They're not really seeds, but pieces of debris that come with cotton when it's not all the way cleaned out. I'm trying, that wool is sometimes used as a batting, and quilts are sometimes made out of wool, particularly in New England. We weren't, here in Bergen County, we don't see a lot of the variety of the kinds of batting. I think everything that we saw was a cotton batting. So no, it's difficult to use just batting to date something, and you sort of have to look at all aspects of the quilt to try to come up with a time period, the fabrics, the style, the workmanship, etc.
Okay, there's a couple of questions here from EM. Absolutely gorgeous, each a work of art. Thank you. Is there a catalog available now? Can't wait to see them in person.
The catalog has been sent to the publisher, and the proofs are awaiting our perusal tomorrow, and we hope to sell sometime this spring. Since we're not having the show, we're going to release the catalog. I mean, we will have the show eventually, but it looks like it may be a while before we can do that. So we will release the catalog, and you'll get to enjoy the photos, and then hopefully you will come to the show when we have it. So though I think the Mahwah Museum store may carry it. There's been some talk about that, and it will be available on the Ridgewood Historical Society website. If you go to our website for the show, Bergen County Quilt and Coverlet Show.com, we'll have the news and links there, and you can sign up for our blog. We blog occasionally, and would like to stay connected with people while we're waiting for this show to happen.
Okay, are regions known for particular patterns? Example, are there a lot of log cabin patterns in New Jersey, or do families specialize in certain patterns?
The quilts that we saw are a sort of, they're not necessarily representative selection of what survives from that time period, because we basically did not have many things from family collections. So that there is a book published by the New Jersey Heritage Quilt Project about New Jersey quilts, and they came to some conclusions about characteristics. So there are some regional characteristics of quilts. I really can't come to any conclusions about Bergen County quilts based on the numbers that we have. I'm not sure that answered the question.
This is from Leslie. Can you tell me about paper piercing?
Paper piecing.
Oh, piecing, I'm sorry, yes.
You can make a template out of paper or stiff paper or cardboard and wrap a fabric around it, and then put the templates next to each other and sew the edges. And that was not a common thing that we saw, but we do have one quilt in the show that was made that way, and it fits in that crazy quilts and other fancies category. It's made out of silk and made in that time period, but it's totally original, made out of very high quality silk, and just an amazing creation. So you'll have to wait for the catalog or the show.
Okay, is modern quilting different from the quilting of the 1800s?
Wow. We still make quilts for all the same reasons. And modern quilting uses some tools that our foremothers would not have imagined and probably not have wanted to use. Special rulers, rotary cutters. There's, of course, a much wider sharing of information through not only print media, which was early 20th century, but of course social media, and there's strong quilt organizations as opposed to local neighborhood groups that would have been true in the 19th century. Some people are creating their own quilts, and their own patterns, and is actually a category of art quilts, so comparable to painting or sculpture, or people are working in fabric and making art.
Okay. Looks like we're at the end of the questions. There were several comments of thanking you for a wonderful and informative presentation, and I joined them in that. With that, we would like to thank you, everyone out there, for joining us tonight. Again, please follow the Mawa Museum webpage where all our information, upcoming events are coming up. I do hope you would consider either becoming a member or both, becoming a member of the museum or making a donation to the museum. We're a little museum that is pretty vibrant, and we put together a lot of shows, a lot of presentations. Um, all the volunteers here are just that, they're volunteers. No one gets paid for anything that we do here. It's all commitment and dedication. So you could be assured that all your donation dollars and your membership dollars are going directly into these programs and into the physical makeup of the exhibits. I hope that you will not only participate in future uh, events, but also visit the museum. We're open on Saturdays from 1 to 4, 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. Once we get past this pandemic phase, we will be expanding those hours, but we do look forward to seeing you either virtually or in person. So thank you, everyone. Have a good evening. Stay safe and see you soon. Good night.
Good night.